Love New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for April 7th, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this day, this Wednesday. And got some interesting texts for today, I will say. We've got Leviticus 10, Psalm 11 and 12, and then we have Proverbs 25, and then 1 Thessalonians 4. So why don't we start out with, we've been starting out with Thessalonians, so why don't we do that again? So in Thessalonians, we have Paul giving some exhortations now to the church there at Thessalonica, and he is exhorting them to that they're doing well, but he's exhorting them to do better. And so this is kind of a pastoral thing, right? To keep on doing what you're doing and keep on being vigilant, because that is the process of sanctification. You always want to be vigilant. And he exhorts them specifically in two areas here. In these, it's really, this text is kind of divided into two parts: the exhortations from chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, and then in verse 13, it switches to a different topic. But these first exhortations have to do with sexual immorality and sexual purity. And he even says that this is the will of God, your sanctification. You're being separated out and dedicated to God, becoming more like Christ. And how do you do that? Primarily abstaining from sexual immorality. And that's something I think that speaks fairly clearly to our world today, where it's probably in many ways similar to that ancient Greco-Roman context where it was so prevalent in that day, and it is today as well. And yet I would even say even more so, because it is things like pornography and other sexual temptations are at the click of a mouse, so to speak. And so you really have to maintain that vigilance and that dedication towards sanctification. And yes, God will forgive, as it says here. And yet we also need to understand that there can be terrible consequences for those types of sins. In verses 9 through 12, he moves on to exhortations to love and to work. And remember that one of the things that Paul is addressing here is the problem of idleness. And so he exhorts them to still excel more and make it their ambition to lead a quiet life and to attend to your own business and work with your hands, just as we commanded you, and behave properly to outsiders. And so continue and not being lazy, but being vigilant in the work of God and just the work that God has allotted to us. And then probably some of the more encouraging verses in all the Bible, and you probably have heard these at funerals even, are verses 13 through 18 and following, even going into chapter 5. And we have here, of course, that famous verse where Paul says, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who are asleep. Of course, talk about those who are dead, so that you will not grieve as the rest of the world do, who have no hope. This past Sunday at Easter, we talked about the hope that we have, the living hope that we have in Christ. And we have that hope because Christ, as Paul says here, died and rose again. And because he is the first fruits of that, we know that we who if we fall asleep, we will be raised with him as well. And so we have that hope, the hope of the resurrection, the hope, as Peter says, of an inheritance that will not pass away. And therefore we can not grieve as the world does. We grieve, yes. Paul's not saying here not to grieve, but we grieve in a different way, don't we? And therefore we can comfort one another with that truth and with that reality and with that that glorious benefit of the gospel, right? That we will one day be raised with him. So that's 1 Thessalonians 4. We'll move on to Proverbs 25. So here in Proverbs 25, we're moving on, as I mentioned yesterday, to Proverbs that are collected. Were collected during the time of Hezekiah. So just to give you a little bit of a time frame here, Solomon, of course, lived from reign from 971 BC to about 931 BC, so 40-year reign. And then Hezekiah picks up his reign in the latter part of the 700s BC. So we're talking about a good 200 years after Solomon, where these are transcribed. And many of the same themes are hit on here. But one thing that struck me about this as I was reading through it again is that you see some of the things that Jesus teaches about are talked about here. So it again shows us, I think, that Jesus isn't always just making up things that are new, right? But that he is teaching and exhorting based on revelation that has already been given to the Jewish people. So, for instance, in verse 21, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink, for you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. So you can look up Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount to see something very similar to that for Jesus. So anyway, I think you have some interesting, and I think you'll find some others that are like that as well. As you read through this. In fact, Jesus, of course, emphasizes things like the dangers of wealth and the dangers of the tongue and these types of things that are emphasized in the book of Proverbs. So moving on, we'll go to Leviticus, and this is Leviticus 10 is one of the more challenging, I guess you could say, texts in the book of Leviticus, and it's also one of the more you might even say scary text in the book of Leviticus, because here in Leviticus we have, of course, this narrative of Nadab and Abihu, who are the sons of Aaron, who offer what is called in the text strange fire. Now, this is probably referring to the incense offering that was commended in, of course, the book of Leviticus, and this is in the tent of meeting. And so what is wrong with what they do here? Well, there's a lot of controversy over what is in fact this strange fire. It could be that they're offering at the wrong time of day. It could be that it is somehow an illegitimate incense that's being offered. We just don't know. There are a lot of different theories that we don't really need to go into, except to say that God takes seriously how he is approached. And he must be approached in a holy way. It shows something, a very visible and very dramatic way. I think it showed to that original audience the holiness of God. But it also, God doesn't change, does he? So if he was holy back then, if he was that pure that he could not be approached in an unholy manner, then he's the same today. And yet the way in which we who are unholy can approach him is because we have a high priest, unlike Nadab and Abihu, who are unholy. We have a high priest who is holy himself already, and who brought the right sacrifice before God himself, the once for all sacrifice. And that's how we have access to this holy and righteous God. It makes you, I think, appreciate this. A text like this makes you appreciate, number one, the holiness of God, but number two, the greatness of Jesus as our high priest in our once for all sacrifice. And that brings us finally to the book of Psalms. And I believe we're looking at Psalm 11 and 12 today. I want to focus in on Psalm 12 because I think it's an interesting psalm for a couple reasons. This is a communal lament. So you'll notice that there's a absence of references to I and my in this text, where it's the author is expressing more of a personal feeling, but this is something that the community would have expressed. And you'll notice right away that this is a text that focuses in on the theme of speech. And it has a particular structure to it. It has what we would call a chiastic structure, where you have an A, B, in this case, an A, B, C, C, B, A pattern. So it begins, and these, the A's correspond, the B's correspond, and the C's correspond. In other words, you have the psalm beginning and ending with the same thing. And then the second element in the psalm corresponds with the second to last element in the psalm. The third element in the psalm corresponds to the third to last element in the psalm. So this is what we call a chiastic pattern, or it's a kind of a mirror-like pattern. It's called chiasm because the Greek letter is chi, which is an X, and it kind of has that mirror-like pattern to it. So it begins with a complaint concerning the wicked. It will end with a complaint concerning the wicked. The second element is a statement concerning the quality of someone's speech, in this case, the wicked person's speech. And then the second to last element, verses 6 and 7, is a statement about God's speech. And then there's a direct quotation from the wicked in and this is verse 4, and there's a direct quotation of God in verse 5. So you got that nice ABC, CBA pattern. But I want to focus in on this idea of speech, because it is a major theme of the psalm, and I think we can learn a lot about speech from this psalm. First of all, we can see that speech is something that can be used for both revelation, God's divine revelation, but also for lies, right? So it can be used to build up and to tear down. It can be used as an instrument of praise, and an instrument of revealing something of the character of God, like we find in Scripture. And at the same time, it can be used as an instrument of destruction and can be polluted in great ways. And you've experienced this probably in your own life. And we all struggle with this in some ways. And James Montgomery Boyce had a famous quotation, let's see if I can remember it, something to the effect of, the higher or finer a thing is, the more vulnerable it is to perversion, pollution. And so we have this fine gift of speech, and yet it can be used and polluted in many ways. But the word of Yahweh, the speech of Yahweh, is pure and stronger than any of the verbal abuse of the wicked. And so it is effective. It accomplishes what it sets out to do. And God's speech is pretty amazing, isn't it? But we need to be careful not to fall into the temptation, as the wicked are talked about here, to use speech to lie, to even flatter. Verse 2, flattering lips of smooth things is literally in the Hebrew, I believe it is, because God will judge that speech. God takes speech seriously, doesn't he? As we see in this text. And speech ultimately, as Jesus will talk about, betrays the inner quality of the person. Out of our mouths comes what is in our hearts ultimately. And so we can say a lot, I think, about speech based on a text like this. So lots to meditate on, right? From all these different texts. And I think I've hit on all of them. So we got Leviticus 10, Psalm 11 and 12, Proverbs 25, and 1 Thessalonians 4. So I hope that's been an encouraging meditation for you this day, and some encouraging reads for you this day, and challenging reads for you this day, on this day, April 7th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.